I hope you are getting mentally prepared to prepare your favorite comfort food after this message tonight. But if we haven't met before, my name is Sarah. I get to be one of the pastors here at Calvary Young Adults. And I'm actually really excited to be here tonight talking about relationships in the kingdom of God. That's a series we've been in for pretty much the entire summer. And tonight is the last sermon installation. We'll have one more week where we do kind of like a Q&R to answer all the questions you guys have been submitting throughout this series. But yeah, I have the privilege of talking about grief and failed relational expectations. So buckle up. But as I was thinking about tonight, and maybe you're like, I am not in a season of grief. Hopefully this will help someone that you love. But I was thinking about like circumstances that I've been through in my life where I'm like, man, that was just like a bummer. Maybe that wasn't like a failed relationship, but just like, what are some just like annoying things that can happen? And I was looking up examples of, you know, the idea of like you order something online and then like you get something in person and you're like, what on earth? Picture this. I'm just going to walk because I found some gems on the internet. Picture this. So it is congratulations. You are now an aunt or uncle, and you have a cute little niece, and it's her birthday. And her parents come to you, your brother and sister, and they're like, listen, I know you're trying to gun for being like best aunt or uncle ever. So you're in charge of the birthday cake this year. And you're like, awesome. That's easy. Like, I don't even have to make the birthday cake. And you know that your little niece is super into My Little Pony, so you're like, great. I'm going to scour on the internet, and I'm going to find the best little My Little Pony birthday cake ever, right? It's super adorable. I'm like, wow, is there even cake underneath that fondant? But you take this picture, and you go to the baker, and you're like, okay, can you do this? You have one job. Like, I need to come through for my niece's birthday, and they look at you, and they're like, yeah, pay us all the money. We'll do it. So you pay them all the money, and you're going to pick the cake up. And upon your arrival, they're like, perfect, we completed it, it's everything you ever wanted. And then this is what gets delivered. Guys, this is real. Like, this is a real story of someone online. Can you imagine? Okay, so this happens, and you deliver the birthday cake, and I'm sure, like, your niece is like, it's pony, it tastes delicious. But year 2 rolls around, and you're like, I'm going to redeem myself. Like last year did not go so well. And this time you were probably a little more guarded in your expectations, but you're like, I'm going to give this baker one more shot. I'm going to go back and I'm going to give them something. I'm going to lower the bar. And this year she's really into Tinkerbell. So you're like, okay, and you're literally like, this is my expectation, right? This is my expectation. And you bring it to them and you pay them all the money and they're like, don't worry, we got this time. And then it's 1 week later, it's her birthday. And you go, and you come, and this is the reality of what you get. Again, this is a real-life thing that happened to someone out in the world. I'm giving you this scenario because it's, right? And this is easy to laugh at, and we're like, man, like, that would suck, but you'd probably get over it. But when we're talking about, like our expectations versus reality, like this can be cute and fun until like in our lives, these requests are actually not going to a baker, they're going to God. And there's things in our lives where we're like, okay, God, like here, this is exactly what I want. Like this is the thing, and it's even in your word, and I think I'm praying the right things and I'm bringing it before you, but I feel like I keep getting this Tinkerbell cake instead of my request. And what can happen when we're in that place, right? Like where our expectations just keep getting like demolished over and over and over again. Whether it's a relationship that you've been in and you just feel like it fell to pieces, or maybe it's the relationship that hasn't even started yet that you feel like you've been asking and petitioning for. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about what happens when we as the people of God experience failure in relationships, or even grief in relationships. And I'm actually really, I guess excited isn't the right word. I'm excited for what God's going to do, but I'm glad that I get to preach on this message tonight because this is actually an area where I feel like the Lord has really met me over the years. This is a place where I've seen God's character time and time again, and he has brought me through the lows and shown me who he is. So I'm going to share a little bit of my story and then just what I feel like the Lord has shown me through that. And I hope that it brings you more hope. I hope it brings you more peace. And I hope it brings you expectation of a good future in the Lord. So it goes a little something like this. Like many of you, maybe not all of you, but I graduated high school pretty optimistic about my relational future. I had been dating like a Christian guy who wasn't really following the Lord. So I went into college and I was like, I'm excited for my upgrade. Like I'm excited to like actually have a relationship that honors Jesus. And I happened to go to a Christian school in the South. I won't name names, so you'll probably guess by the end of this talk. And I think I just went into college not like super focused on relationships, but just with the expectation that it was going to happen, right? Like how life, when you're young, can just seem so linear. You're like, I'm going to go to school. I'm going to meet someone. We're going to get married. I'm going to land a job. We're going to have kids, all by the time I'm 25, you know? So it wasn't really on the forefront of my mind. In fact, when I went into college, my one prayer to the Lord was actually, God, would you just like keep me undistracted from guys? Like, I actually used the term veil. I was like coming to my faith for the first time. I was like, God, would you veil me from the wrong men? And just help me focus on a relationship with you and community. And that's what happened. It was actually really awesome. I feel like I got to walk deeper into what it means to be known by people who love Jesus. I got to walk deeper in what it means to know who God is and actually know who I am. But what didn't happen was graduating with my MRS degree, which if you've been to a Christian school, that just means I did not get married. And now it's clicking. Now you're thinking, you're like, MRS, Mrs. It's a Mrs. degree or Mr. degree. I think going into school, again, like I wasn't the girl that was like, I have to get married. But when you go to school in the South and you've attended 17 weddings by the time you're a senior, I'm not making that number up. That's not a preacher's count. You actually start, like, I think subliminally what happened was I started to wonder, like, okay, like maybe why not me? Or like, why isn't this my timing? And then I kind of like gathered myself together as I graduated because I was moving back to California and I was like, okay, Lord, maybe it's just not a Southern boy. No offense. Southern people are great, but I was like, maybe it's just not for me. Maybe we're just not compatible, you know? Yes. We do love you, Jordan. But you live here now, so what does that say? And I moved back home, and I think my hopes were still like pretty high. And you graduate, you're getting older. I'm like, okay, I'm moving towards this invisible timeline is now becoming like more visible. Where I'm like, all right, now this is my opportunity. And I came home, and I got really involved here in ministry, and it was great. I got to really like understand what my calling was. I took a job at Calvary, and I began to meet some really awesome men of God. And as the story went, what kept happening was I would be really into someone, and they just wouldn't be that into me. And don't feel that bad I'm just kidding. And vice versa. No, I would have these great guys ask me out, and I had, at the time I was like, I'm going to be open. If they love the Lord, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to go on a date with them. But it would be first date, second date. I just wouldn't have peace, and I'd start to get frustrated. I'm like, God, what is happening? It got to the point where I had a small group of 11 women, and about 3 years in, 9 of them were either married or in a serious relationship. And there was like 2 of us left. And they just it happens. They transition off into like marriage, or they move or start a family. But I think that was the point where I took a step back and was like, whoa, I have some seriously unmet expectations that I didn't even know that were inside of me. Where I was like 24, 25, and I was like, man, by this point in my life, I thought I'd at least be like dating someone, like moving towards marriage. And it surprised me because it had never been something I grew up like, or even something people pressured me into. But it was this desire that started to unearth in me. And I really just brought that to the Lord and was like, God, something doesn't feel right. I started to feel like this hopelessness inside of me to the point where I'd even look at friends that I loved in relationships and felt this grief over it. I felt this like joylessness. Sometimes it was even hard to like attend friends' weddings because I was just like, man, like what is wrong with me? And then I stumbled across this verse in scripture that just like put words to exactly what I was feeling. And I'm wondering if any of you have ever felt this. Proverbs 13:12 says this. It says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. And I was like, yes, like this is exactly, like I feel like I have a heart sickness. Like it feels like I have this sickness inside of me that just like, it's blurring my view of the goodness of others' relationships and even like the hope for my own future. Because I kept, what I was doing and what I realized what I was doing was I was putting my hope and expectation in a circumstance that just kept getting pushed off further and further off track from my personal timeline. And my heart became sick. And as Brian talked about last week, if our heart is the wellspring of life, the thing we're supposed to guard above all else, what happens is if we're not careful, just these seeds of lies and even hopelessness can start to breed and contaminate our hearts. And what happened for me was I started to lose trust in God. Like it started so minuscule, and over time, I kept looking at him going, Lord, you haven't come through with this thing that I've desired for so long. God, I've submitted my request to you, and I've been faithful to you, but you just seem unresponsive, unempathetic, even uncaring. And I began to speak things over God that weren't true. Why would I do this? Because again, my lens of him started to change to the point where I actually began to believe the lie that I was actually a better author of my story than God was. That my time over God's was actually the perfect timing. And there's these things that would come up inside of me, these what ifs, like maybe if I was in a relationship, I wouldn't feel so lonely. Or I'd see my friends in relationships more. Or I'd feel more secure. Then as my circumstances didn't change, the thoughts actually turned into this, like the big what if, right? That I think a lot of single Christians hold of like, well, what if I never get married? Will I always be lonely? Will I ever be enough? And because I started to believe only what I could see, and because I began to judge based on his ability to provide what I wanted when I wanted it, I put trust in myself, at least in this area. Specifically in this area, I was like, all right, God, if you're not taking control of this, I'm going to take control of this. And Proverbs 3, verses 5-6 says this. It encourages us as believers, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on what? Your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. So I learned what it looked like to not trust the Lord with all my heart and choose to lean on my own understanding. And I got myself into a situationship. If you don't know what that is, you could watch the YouTube from last week. He definitely just needed a spotter at the gym, but I liked the attention. So, and you know what happened was I began to use like my crooked relational path because that wasn't what the Lord wanted for me. Like that was not a man bringing me closer to Christ. But I started to use my own crooked relational path as confirmation bias that God wasn't actually trustworthy. I was like, look, God, look, nothing works out. Instead of recognizing that was a choice, that was my own decision. But deep down, I still blame God for my own short-sightedness and for how others began to fail me. And there's this gap that can grow between you and the Lord in seasons like that. And what can happen that can be so dangerous to our faith is that we fill it with misconceptions of who God is, right? That God is uncaring, untrustworthy, unempathetic. Because here's the truth of what begins to happen. When we don't see God rightly, we actually can't see ourselves rightly. It started with thoughts towards God where I'm like, well, God, you're uncaring, you're unkind. And then quickly it became thoughts like this, well, I'm actually not worthy. I must be broken, or I must be bad for people. That's why things aren't working out, or I'm just attracting the wrong kind of person. And things like that, while at first can seem so jarring, over time can start to sound like truth because they're familiar, right? It's the record that plays inside our own head, our own voice, or the voice of the enemy, the accuser, suddenly got so loud with lies and accusations and worries that it really broke me down. Like on the outside, people are like, you're like sunshine, like we see God in you, which is true. Like God can work through you in your brokenness. But there's just this one area that I couldn't let go of because I didn't trust God anymore. And thankfully, I had a good friend in that season who I opened up to her about my situationship, and she was like very non-judgmental, thank God. But she asked me this really important question. She asked, well, what does God say about it? What does God say about your relational life right now? And I was like, oh, I don't want to ask. I don't want to ask because I have these bitter feelings towards the Lord in this area, but also I haven't slowed down to actually come before God. And I was reading recently in this book by Frederick Buechner. He's like kind of a contemporary of C.S. Lewis. They gave us this book at my seminary graduation over a year ago. I hadn't picked it up. But this passage came up this week, and I was like, man, he's so right. And he's talking about his own kind of failed expectations in his life and what can happen. And he's describing this picture of sometimes when disappointment comes, the last thing we want to do is actually slow down and talk to God about it. It's like almost cathartic to just keep going in our busyness and even just in what we can control. And he describes kind of how his life just became this race to the top for the best job, the best university, just distracting himself, numbing himself because he didn't want to face this area of his life where he felt like God really let him down. But he shares this in reflection. He says, sometimes we avoid listening for fear of what we may hear. Sometimes for fear that we may hear nothing at all, but the empty rattle of our own feet on the pavement. But be not afraid, says another. For lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. He says he is with us on our journeys. He says he has been with us since each of our journeys began. Listen for him. Listen to the sweet and the bitter airs of your present and your past for the sound of him. And I just think that's so profound. That it's for fear often we don't slow down and say, God, but what do you think about this? What do you think about me? What do you think about not only my present, but my past? And what he's highlighting here as he reflects on who Jesus is, it's not just what Jesus will say. Like sometimes we're afraid, like, gosh, what if he encourages me to do something that's going to be uncomfortable? But it's not just what Jesus is going to say. It's who Jesus is that makes him worth listening to. It's who Jesus is, the same Jesus where he's quoting scripture right here that tells his followers, and surely I am with you to the end of the age. This is him talking to his disciples when he's returning after his resurrection, and he's commissioning them. And he's saying, surely I'm going to be with you. I promise to be with you. Not only that, but he's declaring the truth that I have been with you since your journey began. Through your moments of failure, through your heartaches and hope and hopelessness, in the bitter and the sweet, I have been with you. I promise to be with you. This is the same Jesus we're invited to look at as the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising shame, and sat at the right hand of the throne of God. This is the Jesus that walks with you. The author, that means he was there for before time, and the finisher. He can go before you where you have not been, but he promises to be with us. So why is it important? Like, why is Frederick Buechner in this moment going, it's important to remember who Jesus is before we even ask, before we even listen? And it's this. The character of God is going to be a better indicator of your future than our current circumstances. The character of God is a better definer of what's to come than what you're facing right now, or what your past has been comprised of. You see, circumstances can change, but God does not. We change, hopefully for the better, but God does not. People fail us, but God will not. We fail, but God will never fail. You see, he holds the power to change our circumstances. But what I really felt led in the preparation, because yes, I want us to be hopeful. If you're in a place where you're like, man, I just feel like again and again, I'm just receiving failure or rejection, God can change that. But even as I was praying and listening, I just feel like the Lord just wants to remind us, like, he's not only the way maker. Like, we sing that, and that's so special because who else can? Who else goes before us? He knows our future. He can change circumstance. But he's not only that, guys. Like, he is the way. Like, he is the way. He's not just a means to an end. He is the end. He is everything that we seek, whether it's in a relationship or in acceptance or love or peace or joy, whatever it is, we seek him. And it's not bad to seek relationship. It's not bad to seek connection. Those things are gifts from God. But I think we do sometimes have to come to a place when we're in that moment of God. I just feel like my circumstances have failed me again and again to remind me that even when we don't have the gift, like we have the giver. We have him. And he's the God that sits with you in your grief. Like he sat with me so many times in my grief and didn't rush me out. Like we all have those well-meaning friends that want to sit with you, but they also want to like fix the situation ASAP. So they ask you all the questions and you're like, I just need you to be here with me. He's a God who knows where you've been, like the good, bad, and ugly. He knows you better than anyone on this planet ever will. No partner, no spouse, no parent, no friend. And unlike anyone we know on this side of eternity, he actually knows what's next. Not only that, but he's a God who has a holier imagination for your life than you do. Like even at our best, like we're told that his thoughts like outnumber the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach. Like his thoughts towards us are not just great in number, but they are great. They are great in quality. Like he knows you and he dreams of good things for your life and dreams that he could actually make a reality. He's a God whose heart for you is good, even when you've hardened yours towards him. That's something I've learned again and again and again. And once more, I'm not saying desiring a healthy relationship is a bad thing. I think if anything through this series, we're like, please desire goodness. Please desire a relationship and relationships in your life that are worthy of a life that is following the Lord. But I am calling you in this moment to embrace your current circumstance, if that's you. If you're in this place where you're like, I just feel let down. And embrace the relationships that will always be available to you. The relationship that will always be available to you. So this is you, or this is maybe someone that you love who's walking through a season of failed expectations. Here are some practical steps. Here are some things, if you're like, I'm a practical person, this is for you, where you can move forward into a place of trust. Because ultimately, the Lord, he wants to sit with you in compassion. He wants to address your grief, but he also wants to move with you through grief, because grief can't be circumvented, right? It has to be moved through. So here are some steps. For one, slow down and remind your soul who's in control. Slow down. It can be such a tried verse that we hear over and over again, but truly like being still and recognizing God as God can be healing for your soul. Like we need that perspective. One of my favorite stories